Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is To Lead is to Learn. In this new podcast, we're going to be exploring leadership theories and practices. On today's episode, we are going to be looking at the self-aware leader. So before we get too far into the self-aware leader, let's first consider the question, what is self-awareness? Well, self-awareness is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a measure of our awareness of self. This is how aware are we of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's defined as a conscious knowledge of one's own character and feelings. A high measure of self-awareness means a high level of understanding of how we react in certain situations. It is an understanding of our instinctive impulses and how we react to a given situation. How we emotionally respond to a situation precedes our rational response. A greater awareness of this can help us to rationally control and restrain our base instinct, particularly in situations of high stress or high anxiety. What does it mean to be self-aware? We become self-aware when we reflect on our experiences of perceiving and processing stimuli from the world around us. There are levels of this, from autobiographic, where we reflect on past events that involved us, to prospection, which is looking forward to the future. Now, this can involve both emotions, thoughts, it can involve personality traits about us, personal preferences we have, the goals that we might have, the attitudes we might take, our perceptions of certain events, sensations, intentions, the list goes on and on. But we can also reflect on the now, our private self, the emotions or traits which occur internally right now, as well as our public self, the visible characteristics, mannerisms, and behaviors that we portray to the world around us. There's a whole nother level of this as well, which becomes hugely important to us when we are considering leading others. These are called corollaries. Now, this involves two things. This is our self-agency. This is the concept of will, the concept that we have a level of control over ourselves, as well as our theory of mind. This is the ability which we have to perceive and make inferences on the mental state of others, the ability that we have to determine the thoughts, feelings, and reasonings behind actions that others take. This also involves our ability to determine the impact on others of the actions that we take, and that is very important when we're considering leading others. Now, there are also many other levels of self-awareness which become important within this particular topic. This includes our self-description, which is how we personally describe ourselves, our self-evaluation, which is how we judge ourselves and our performance, self-esteem, how we feel about ourselves, self-regulation, how we control our instincts, self-efficacy, our beliefs in our ability to perform in the pursuit of goals, our death awareness, which is the awareness we have of our own mortality, our self-conscious emotions, our awareness of how we're feeling right now, our self-recognition, which is our awareness to recognize ourselves, our actions, and our behaviors, as well as self-talk, which is our inner voice. Now, a couple of these are going to become very important later on. This will be self-evaluation, self-regulation, and self-talk. So within all of this, a sense of continuity across time is necessary, as well as being able to distinguish oneself from the rest of the environment. There is a level of consciousness involved in all of this. A leader who is self-aware has an increased ability to consider others, their thoughts and feelings, their emotions and their states of mind. They are able to consider their possible responses to our actions and the demands placed on them by the working environment which they are in. A self-aware leader is also able to consider the external impact on their followers of their wider lives. They take an interest in this in order to understand the individuals which they lead. So what role does consciousness play within self-awareness? A paper from 2003 by Elaine Morin summarizes 4 levels of consciousness. The first level is unconsciousness. This is a state of being non-responsive to oneself and their surroundings. The second level is consciousness. This is a state of focusing one's attention on the environment, processing incoming external stimuli. Self-awareness is the third level. This is a state of focusing on one's attention on yourself, processing private and public information about yourself. The fourth and final level is called meta-self-awareness. Now, this is a state of being aware that one is self-aware. Now, this third level, which is self-awareness, has 3 finer sublevels. These are private self-awareness, public self-awareness, and social anxiety. Private self-awareness itself has 2 further sublevels. These are self-reflection and self-rumination. Self-reflection is a measure of our curiosity of ourselves. This is reflecting on our emotions, values, thought processes, and attitudes. Higher levels of this leads to increased self-knowledge and self-regulation. The second one is self-rumination, which is a level of anxiousness in terms of anxious attention on oneself. Here, this is where we have our fear of failure, as well as wondering about our level of self-worth. Excessive amounts of this rumination creates worry, guilt, shame, jealousy, can lead to insomnia, and may lead to psychological dysfunctions such as anxiety and depression. So you can see that self-rumination can actually lead to social anxiety, that third level of self-awareness. Between the second and third layers, that is, consciousness and self-awareness, might lie a state of being aware of the social environment we're in. Now, this can be quite poignant when it comes to the work environment that we're within. If, for example, we are within a work environment that emphasizes your individual unique characteristics, this can lead to individuation and therefore enhances that self-focus. Whereas you may find yourself within a work environment where, rather than focusing on the individual characteristics of you, you might be in an environment which encourages similarity in terms of behavior, appearance, or values. A classic example of this would be the army. Now, this produces de-individuation and decreases self-focus. Instead, focus is given to the group. As a leader, we should be aware of the important role self-awareness plays to both us, ourselves, as well as those which we lead. We need to be able to promote togetherness by pointing out the shared values and goals of the team. And we need to be aware of when this should be used, because we should also be able to promote self-reflection and celebrating our differences. Now, a way to encourage self-attention and self-focus would be to list ways in which we are different to others. This can be a way to draw our attention back from the group onto ourselves, which is very important when we're wanting to work on ourselves. Self-reflection requires the attention to focus on the self rather than the collective or on others. When we are looking to develop individual traits and characteristics to improve our practice, we must first focus on ourselves. This is a way in which we can achieve the correct direction of our attention. Within that same 2003 paper, Alain Morin outlined his model, which he developed and fine-tuned. Now, in this model, he shows the impact that self-awareness can have on individual development. In order to explore this model, first we need to consider two key concepts, and that is the real self and the ideal self. Now, the real self, this is a measure of who we are right now, is our current self, or in other words, the reality. Whereas the ideal self is the person who we would like to be, the person who we aspire to be. And we use this person personally as a guide. Now, in a state of self-awareness, what happens is someone goes through a process called self-evaluation and self-criticism. Here, we measure our real self against our ideal self, and we look to see if we can find a discrepancy, if we have not matched up against our ideal self. Now, when we find there's a discrepancy, it's the size of that discrepancy that then determines what happens next. Now, in this model, if there is a large positive or negative discrepancy, this will lead to a low rate of progress being made. This is because we enter a state known as avoidance or escape. We personally don't like large discrepancies between the real self and the ideal self. Now, if it's only a small positive or negative discrepancy, this leads to a high rate of progress. And this progress comes in two forms. Either there is a focus on the real self that is identified, and therefore we change the real self. Now, ideally, this occurs when there's negative discrepancies in terms of our real self is slightly below our ideal self, and therefore we try to change our real self to bring it up to the ideal self. However, we could instead have a focus made on the ideal self, which therefore means we change the standard. Now, the ideal here is that this occurs with positive discrepancies. In other words, our ideal self is below our real self. We find out we're actually ahead of our ideal self, and therefore we need to change the standard and promote the ideal self to be ahead of us. We do not want to have a measure of our real self being below our ideal self and then changing our ideal self down. So there is an ideal here, and that is we always look to improve the standard we're going for and improve the real self, who we actually are. Another paper in 2003 by Moskalenko and Heine found that external feedback from others could lead to avoidance of self-awareness. Their findings showed that positive feedback could lead to low levels of avoidance, such as mechanisms of procrastination. They also found that negative feedback had the opposite effect, increasing levels of avoidance and procrastination. Providing no feedback at all has an impact between the two. However, it lies closer to the impact of positive feedback. This shows that negative feedback can lead to individuals avoiding self-reflection and therefore reduces the rate of progress in terms of individual development. However, there is a caveat here. We must be careful with the level of positive feedback we give, as although this leads to self-reflection and personal growth, this can also lead to complacency and a lowering of the standard if falsely given praise. It has also been shown that these discrepancies can impact emotional intensity, how intensely we experience emotions. In other words, it amplifies the emotions which results from the discrepancy. So examples of this could be a person experiencing a more intense joy following a successful experience. So following on from success, a subsequent experience of joy is heightened. You could have a more painful feeling of disappointment following on from a failure. So following on from a particular failure, if you have a subsequent disappointment, this becomes even more painful. There's also examples of emotional lethargy, which is, in other words, not feeling emotions, following on from social rejection. So individuals shut off from their negative emotions following social rejection in order to avoid feeling negative feelings. This should be considered when leading others, as we would need to be aware of not compounding the emotions felt by others. It's our job as a leader to be aware of the emotional state of our followers and help them to navigate the path through this, particularly within the workplace. An example of this would be to provide opportunities to experience an easy success following a large failure. We would not want to provide them with a tough challenge following a failure, as this could compound the emotional response they're currently feeling and provide the discrepancy and therefore cause a reduced rate of progress, because they would feel failure. This would then be compounded to an even greater failure, emphasizing the discrepancy, causing them to reduce their rate of growth and progress. Self-aware individuals know themselves better, and this increases the consistency between their behavior and their attitudes. This also causes a reduction in what we call the self-serving bias, which is the tendency to attribute failure internally. In other words, the higher someone's self-awareness is, the more aware they are of the role of others, and the less likely they are to take failure personally and trigger self-rumination. They are therefore more likely, with higher levels of self-awareness, to reflect positively on the failure, as there will be a smaller discrepancy between the real self and the ideal self, and this promotes progress and personal development. Our ability to reflect also allows us to navigate our social environment, in other words, our work environment in this case, which increases the chances of being successful at work. One of the most important aspects of self-awareness in this case is self-regulation. This is the altering of our behavior, the resisting of temptations, the changing of our moods, the selecting of our responses, and the filtering out of irrelevant information. Self-regulation stops us from being overwhelmed and stops us from acting instinctively without thought or rationalizing. Self-regulation requires us to use the mechanism of self-evaluation. Now, this process consumes an internal store of energy which is depleted throughout the day. It's readily used, but not easily restored. When an individual regulates themselves, they become less likely to successfully regulate themselves later, as they use some of their finite resource. The question then is, what is this resource? Well, it's called willpower. Everyone has a different daily amount of this, and the rate at which it gets used when they're self-regulating is also unique to each of us. This currency, if you like, is exhausted, and it leads to something called ego depletion. Our ego being the part of ourselves which mediates between the wider world around us and our impulses. There are 6 ways which we can help to manage our willpower level and our self-regulation. The first and most important one is self-talk. Now, self-talk can help us to improve our efficiency of self-regulation and therefore the rate at which our willpower is used up, because it calms down our internal instincts and helps us have to self-regulate less often. Another mechanism could be planning ahead, using if-then statements with ourselves, as this can help to reduce the rate at which we have to use up our willpower, because it reduces the need for on-the-spot decisions and therefore reduces the need to control our impulses. An example might be, if I see something that I want to buy and it's less than X amount, then I'll buy it, but if it's over that amount, then I won't. What you've done is you've preloaded a decision, so therefore you do not have to suddenly then control your impulse to buy it. Our third one is managing our diet and getting enough sleep, because what this does is this helps our internal store of willpower. Now, we all know that when we're tired, when we're hungry, we get a little bit irritable. That is our willpower being reduced by the fact that we haven't got food in our bellies and therefore sugar in our system, and we haven't got enough sleep. We haven't refilled that pot of willpower. The fourth one is taking regular breaks to give ourselves positive experiences, things which we enjoy and find rewarding, because that can actually increase our willpower. The fifth one is managing our day. Now, in this case, it's very much doing the hardest thing first when we have the most amount of willpower, and leaving those little things, those easier ones, later on when we have less of it. Now, the sixth one is probably the hardest one to do. This is limiting our exposure to bad habits, because this reduces the need for self-regulation. This includes both reducing the opportunities to be tempted ourselves, as well as seeing others do it. So an example might be overeating sweets. If you don't have sweets around you, you're less likely to have to make that decision to, no, I won't eat it. The other thing might be, if you see someone else eating sweets, you then get that urge to do it yourself, and therefore you have to control that urge. So if you limit the possibility of seeing someone else eating them, then you're less likely to have to control that urge yourself. As a leader, we may need to consider the role which self-regulation plays in our followers. Understanding how everyone is different and how mentally draining it can be to consistently self-regulate may help us understand the demands we put on our followers. Do we provide them with opportunities to help with their self-regulation? How can our use of feedback impact on their self-regulation? Do we provide our followers with breaks and opportunities to do what they enjoy during the day? Do the demands we put on them encroach into their personal lives and therefore their diet, maybe their sleep? Are we ensuring to look after the individuals first in order for them to be in the best position to look after the work? This plays into our theory of mind, a greater understanding of the mental states of others and the impact our words, our actions, and the demands we put on them will allow us to lead more effectively. Remember, leading is centered around our ability to influence others. We cannot do so without a level of empathy. When we take time to reflect on ourselves, we improve our ability to consider others. As well as self-awareness, I want to take a moment to consider predispositions. A predisposition is a tendency to react in a particular way, be that think or act. This is an attitude or reaction which comes as a subconscious response to an external trigger. This is a learned behavior and is a result of our environment, and it takes intentional action to address this. It requires self-regulation. We often consider others to have these as well. I mean, you might be found saying, "Oh, that's just John. He always reacts like that when we ask him to do this." As individuals, we have, through our upbringing and our experiences, learned to classify certain stimuli as being good or bad. This has then been reinforced and stored within our brains as an automatic evaluation. That's how our brains work. That's how we function in the world around us. We have particular things in our brain, maps, if you like, of information, that when we see certain things, our brain makes assumptions that allows us to do things quickly, automatically, without having to think, because thinking is very energetically draining. So this occurs within our subconscious as a predisposition. The stimuli that we've deemed good, we approach. We say, yes, that's something I want to get involved with. Whereas the stimuli that we've deemed as bad, we look to avoid. Now, these negative avoidance predispositions have been shown to occur faster. We very much recoil away from them much quicker. We have an ability to create elaborate predispositions, elaborate evaluations, if you like, based on our social experiences. We can also recode our existing predispositions through learning and changing our experiences with respect to certain stimuli. If you like, we can look at it as a process. Experiences feed evaluations. These evaluations in our brain create predispositions, which then causes us to have certain attitudes towards things. So therefore, whenever we see these stimuli, we automatically have these attitudes towards it. As a leader, this is something we should be aware of when we look to develop others. In order to change behaviors of our followers, we need to change the response to certain stimuli through adapting the environment to promote social experiences around particular stimuli that subsequently reinforce actions and attitudes. If we change the way that certain stimuli are seen, we therefore change the predisposition that individuals have towards them. Once again, I want to leave you with a few questions to reflect upon. The first question: how often do we take time to reflect on ourselves, our practice, and the role we play in our team? The second: how aware are we of the impact our decisions, our actions, what we say, and in particular our feedback has on our followers? And thirdly, what will we change about our practice tomorrow as a result of reflecting on ourselves today? And until next time, remember, to lead requires us to continuously